Okay, I think we've given everyone a minute or so to have joined, so let's get started. So, hello, welcome to our session where I'll be introducing and exploring risk drivers and sensitivity analysis within your project's quantitative risk analysis or QRA models. My name is Chris Ritson and I'll be your Safran host today as we first go through a few concept slides together over the next 25 to 30 minutes perhaps. And today's topic might feel a bit familiar as we previously hosted Dr. David Hewlett on this topic a couple of years ago, where he imparted his story and the co-development history with Safran. But today I'll be putting an intentionally fresh spin on things and reflecting on some anecdotal experiences of my own. So I hope that by the end of this session, you'll be at least slightly more aware of how your peers may be approaching risk modelling in different industries, as I regularly speak to academic university professors, heads of risk and multinationals, government agencies, and everybody in between. And just a warning, it's not my intention to use the live chat today, as frankly, I've struggled to use this LinkedIn Live platform effectively in the past, so questions and comments, they tend to slip through and get missed. We find that there's more robust engagement on our GoToWebinar platform, and we'll actually be using that next week at our major new release event for version 22.1. We have a breakfast webinar where I'll be leading the demonstration, and I'll have a better setup to address any live questions, and I hope to see you there too. So for anybody interested, I'll leave links up on the screen at the end of this session for the separate European and American time zone events, where you can sign up there. But for those that just want to talk to me about today's topics, then the best thing would be to just send me a direct message here on LinkedIn, or I'm just as happy to respond via email, which you can see is on screen now. This just means I'll definitely respond to your query, even if you're watching this on catch up at some point in the future and you're not here now during this live broadcast. Okay, so I'm keen to crack on and be respectful of everybody's time. So let's start by grounding our expectations for what I'm going to cover today and where we're going to get to. So first, I'm going to need to define some of the topics so anybody new to this can follow the concepts. Two, I'd like to cover some of the different approaches and styles to both the inputs and the outputs. And three, I want to give you some discussion around the pros, the cons of these different methods, and then I'm finally trying to summarize some key takeaways for you. Okay, so starting with definitions. Let's look at risk drivers first, and I'm afraid it's not quite as exciting as motorsports, and sadly this metaphor doesn't really work for us, risk drivers, as I want to help orientate everybody around a shared understanding, whether you're a risk modeling novice or an expert. Instead, we'd be better served by looking at a finance investment for a clearer example, such as what drives the price of oil. There's a measurable outcome, the price of oil, and it rises and falls depending on market forces such as supply, demand, investors, national security priorities, and other goals which can be directly influenced by agents acting upon or within the system. And then, of course, there are other uncertain variables that have minds of their own, whose behaviors can unleash unintended consequences across the market that may have a knock-on effect to the price of oil. Now, what I find interesting in this example and many others, such as lifestyle choices that may lead you to developing negative health condition or serious disease, you'll often find these influencing factors referred to as risk factors. But it's effectively an interchangeable term with today's title, risk drivers. So actually, you are probably already intuitively aware of the concept just from reading the newspapers and articles and things like that. But when we ask which of these risk drivers or factors has the greatest effect in determining the oil price, is it supply, demand, or news cycles, that's where sensitivity analysis comes in to provide interpretation. So it's a technique to study how various sources of uncertainty in a mathematical model contribute to the model's overall uncertainty. So hopefully this little example gives us a relatable grounding in what is the core difference between risk drivers and sensitivity analysis. Now together, they help you as a modeler learn how much certain inputs affect the overall output of that modeled system, be it an economy, a market, or indeed a project. So with respect to projects quantitative risk analysis, or QRA, typically you'll have seen what's called a tornado chart. They're used to visually rank those uncertain variables that influence the selected outcome the most. And it gets its name from visually resembling a cone shape, so wider at the top, narrower at the bottom, just like the extreme weather phenomenon. These styles of report instinctively tells us two things. One, what is most driving a project's risk analysis and therefore where to best prioritize your team's energies. And two, it also shows where our existing plans may reveal potential cost or time savings, perhaps as a buffer or a brake against the other negative effects in the model. Now, I find it best to think of this as a strength of relationship between two moving points connected by a piece of invisible string that might be tighter or it might be looser on a case-by-case basis. The tighter the string, the more closely related they are. So as one thing moves, then the other thing tends to move with it, like a shared destiny. Although it's also possible, as we've already seen from the previous tornado graph, for negative correlations to also exist, which simply just means that if event A occurs, then event B is either less likely or maybe even impossible to also occur at the same time. And this is the wonderful world of statistics, mathematical models, and not everybody is literate in this language. So we'll be coming back to this thought and revisiting the implications of communicating risk drivers to lay people. Now, I broadly introduced the concept that some risk modeling inputs will exert different levels of influence on that model's outputs. But let's now talk about the different modeling styles. First of all, as a rule of thumb, I'd say that cost models were probably simpler to produce, understand, and share, like with our initial price of oil example. But when you start to look at schedule risk models or cost risk models that are driven by the schedule related cost, things become harder to decipher and interpret, because you literally have more moving parts within your risk model. Some schedules can run into the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of logic-linked activities. The net effect is like setting off multiple chains of dominoes running in parallel, where they eventually converge on the same ultimate endpoint, but where you don't know how fast each individual chain will fall, and the project isn't going to be considered to have ended until every last domino has fallen. So given that your project reconfigures itself in real time, reacting to new changing information with stakeholders creating unknowable feedback loops, this is one of the primary reasons we use Monte Carlo simulation as the brute force method to test all possible permutations of both team performance and randomized risk events. And this helps us to discover likely alternative sequences of events that are not in the deterministic critical path. So it should be expected with all this variety that your style of risk model could be anything from subtly different to wholesale different from the next person's risk model, or one produced in a different industry to the one that you yourself work in. So just a little spoiler alert from me, I personally don't believe in a one-size-fits-all approach to modeling, partly for the reason I just mentioned, but also because we live in an imperfect world where not everybody has readily available information to the desired level of maturity, or maybe you have a customer or an organization culture that just doesn't support your modeling efforts. But that's okay, because you can still make the best use of what you have. You can substitute data for assumptions, then clearly caveat those in your reports, and then they form the obvious next steps for future refinements until your model does actually become indicative enough and therefore useful enough to support decisions and secure project objectives. Now, because if we only kind of focus on one single formulaic approach and praise that approach above all others, then devoid of context, we risk sort of treating every situation as if it's a nail, and then we'll keep reaching for the hammer when maybe a screwdriver is perhaps what we really need. So let's take a look now at the art of the possible. So for many people, risk ranging the possible duration of each activity is the minimum starting point. And the purpose is to consider the possible extremes of their team and their supply chain's performance, and maybe also giving some credence to the most likely outcome. Now, various uncertainty distribution shapes like these and many others are available, but these are the ones that are most typical in my experience, particularly the triangle. But now what many people maybe forget in their haste to produce a risk model are two key aspects, both of which are temporal in nature. One, what stage in the project lifecycle are you at in terms of understanding your scope, etc.? And two, does your risk model already have plausible risk events added or likely to add many more in the future? Because if you're in the early feasibility stages or you don't have a mature risk register yet, then frankly, you should be considering the more volatile shapes, the uniform, the tri-gen distribution perhaps. And these help you to reflect the confidence that you and the modeler has in the project's own assessment of the uncertainty at hand. And it's a good way of managing expectations, combating bias, and it gives you some wiggle room to sort of redefine or refine your model as the project matures and fresh understanding of your scope, constraints, and other influences are learned and more credible plans begin to get formed. And as you build up that more credible risk model and furnish it with the risk events, you should now be able to narrow your original assessment of the task's duration uncertainty, with the added benefit that once you've articulated a discrete risk event and understand its causes, you're in a stronger position to handle or respond to those causes with treatment strategies and tangible delegated actions. So this is how I've often built risk models, as it helps manage expectations, go big with your estimating uncertainty to begin with, and then sculpt it down, break it down into its constituent parts of hypothetical events that may or may not occur. And by shaping the model's inputs in this way, it helps us to see what is driving the output and allows us to pinpoint where the problem area is really coming from. And it's worth commenting that for many people that I've met, when they undertake their risk ranging, and due to the sort of legacy risk modeling tools out there, such as Oracle Primavera Risk Analysis or Opera, I speak to a lot of people who are tempted to try and uniquely assign estimates to each and every activity. This is going to be quite a time-consuming exercise for them, particularly on a larger project schedule. So I find that their practice does tend to mature towards either A, settling for a quick risk shortcut and apply the same plus or minus percentages across the entire schedule, or B, they use a complicated formula or set of formulas to only apply certain ranges to certain work packages or work breakdown structures, which is definitely a more progressive approach. It's an enhanced, it's better, especially if you actually have that historical information to do this with. However, it can be a bit clunky, and I do remember when we used OPRA, our team had to apply the formulas in a very specific sequence to ensure we didn't overwrite anything that we didn't intend to change, because real life practice doesn't always match the sort of academic expectation. You know, at its worst, you can get some undetected user errors creeping into the model, and it's going to waste your time having to go back and fix those. And at its best, it's just going to be a bit of an inconvenience. So I've already begun sort of the discussion piece really on the pros and the cons, as my career experiences naturally comes across as I speak on these topics, but we're going to stick with the legacy approaches for a little longer and explore it before I introduce the alternative method to approaching risk drivers, which is actually known as the risk driver method. So let's briefly revisit that tornado graph. So the first thing to note is that traditionally, Monte Carlo simulation applications are dealing with probabilistic ranges of outcomes, not definitive singular deterministic answers. And they typically spread these out across multiple reports. So here, say in Safran Risk, you can see how you can show your discrete risk events on your risk register on the left-hand graphic, whereas any embedded schedule uncertainty direct on the schedule is going to come through on the right-hand side. Now, this helps to reveal the full picture in a comprehensible way. However, there are multiple metrics that can be used to change the right-hand graphic, because as per the old adage, that correlation is not necessarily equal to causation. So you can choose to instead blend correlation with two other methods. There's the criticality or the schedule sensitivity index, and that helps to reprioritize those activities that are most often found on the critical path, and they rise up to the top of the chart. So that can be useful. Or if you prefer, you could even change the left-hand tornado to actually show both your estimating uncertainties as if they were discrete risks and consider them side by side with the other risks on the risk register. And this can be incredibly useful for discovering areas of the project that haven't been investigated for potential mitigation yet, such as these two activities highlighted in red that have been displacing two other discrete risks out of that top 10 with respect to completion of the overall finish date. So clearly there's some valid reasons for continuing to use these risk driver or tornado charts, but I'd now like to introduce you to that alternative approach with regard to the risk driver inputs. Now, if you don't typically receive schedules with 3-point estimates and the like already embedded in the schedule and risk ranges, then you can instead use Safran Risk's global risk register as a curated library for your corporate actual experiences, your historical patterns, your lessons learned, or other systemic risk scenarios that you wish to test with. So in here, you can capture and replicate your continual improvement or perceived best practices, and that includes your organization's typical risk drivers. So earlier I said that maturing organizations actually try to assign their performance ranges in accordance with a WBS or a work packages, but it can be a bit clunky when they sort of deploy it with the formulas. So Safran, to my mind, has a better approach to this method because once you articulate an estimating uncertainty here on the risk register, you can then just map it like any other discrete risk, which brings us over to my favorite part of the Safran risk toolset, the risk mapping screen. So hopefully here you can recognize the schedule activity shown down the left-hand side of the screen. And then the columns and the matrix over to the middle and the right-hand side, they represent any duration uncertainties embedded directly within the activities themselves, any estimating uncertainties defined on the project risk register screen, and then you've got the rest of the risk register also from that project risk register screen as well. And from here, what we actually get as we start toggling on the mappings is a sneak preview of the compounding effect of all of those uncertain variables at the bottom with a limited Monte Carlo simulation, and that is indicative of how these inputs will likely drive the activity in question. So it's a very useful real-time feedback tool for your risk workshops as you toggle on and off different risk mappings. But hopefully you can appreciate from this screenshot how easy it is to map a particular work package or WBS, the history, the actuals that you've already got, and then map those to this latest project's equivalent WBS with just a single click on the parent node, and it will cascade that mapping down to all the child activities very quickly and easily. So you're technically not limited to just WBS. You could potentially reorganize the summary groupings of the schedule to something like supply chain partners or anything else that you can imagine, and then just repeat the exercise in a similar fashion. But regardless of what you use as a thematic content to your risk driver with regard to estimating uncertainties of task duration, there is one key thing that I've not yet mentioned, which is worth saying. Safran will default your estimating uncertainties to apply a correlation that combats the effect of something called central limit theorem. And if you want to know more about this, it kind of falls outside the scope of today's session, but just drop me a message and I'll send you a blog that covers it in some more detail. So the advantage here being that compared to some other schedule risk analysis tools on the market that I've used throughout my career as a risk manager over the last 17 years, is Safran is flexible to accommodate any of these imagined user cases. It isn't constrained to just one style. For instance, you may have used qualitative risk range categories like simply toggling low, medium, or high and applying a distribution to each of those. Or maybe you've seen this one, where you say a very aggressive kind of bias in the schedule versus all the way up to sort of very conservative on like a sliding scale. Now, that's fine if that's all you have available as a quick gut feel. But in this modern age of readily available data analytics, I'm sensing that organizations are increasingly able to skip the qualitative method and move straight to historical data to inform their risk models. And I've been creating these kind of historical patterns and things throughout my career. And I know that others in like the oil and gas sector and maybe some others also do this routinely anyway. So you can too. But in the spirit of this being as impartial as possible, I feel obliged to point out that any of these methods that are discussed today are modeling choices. So Safran gives you the flexibility to focus on just one style if you want to, or blend them all together if you want to. But if you do go down that alley of blending them all together, just be careful that you don't double dip on your estimating uncertainty method and accidentally compound one range into another range, etc. But Safran does at least give you the tools to discern any unintended consequences via the real-time analyzer shown here by the arrow. So you can delete and remove the variables as applicable from this screen, or even wholesale untoggle entire methods with a single click. So it's good too. But getting back to one of the main advantages of using Safran's risk driver method as compared to legacy method of uniquely articulating a risk range for each individual activity within the schedule, this method available in Safran allows you to turn off one or more of your estimating uncertainties with ease, learning how each of those risk drivers affects the model outcomes by memorizing the results into your distribution comparison database, which of course is where you typically compare the effectiveness of various different states of your risk model from fully to partially mitigated as required. And these modeling settings can be further augmented by blending pre and post mitigated what if scenarios together as desired, which is worth pointing out as it's a fairly novel feature of Safran as compared with other risk modeling tools in the market. So the key take home message here is that you don't have to go away and rebuild a new risk impacted plan or fiddle with deleting the 3-point estimates directly from within the schedule itself. You can just simply hit a button here and toggle the relevant risk driver off and on as required, minimal fuss. Now, what I've shown there is a manual approach to learning and testing and getting insights into your risk model, and it is a valid one. But sometimes there's a little time for curiosity when you've got a deadline. So this is kind of where automation would also be welcome. So that's where Safran Risk's sensitivity analysis by exclusion tool is going to work powerfully for you. Now, I just like to set the scene. So go back to my previous project. I'm working on a mega project with 100 plus risks mapped to 16,000 line item schedule. And I know my team are going to see one of these tornado charts, right? Like the ones we were looking at earlier. And I know they're going to ask me a very natural and obvious question regarding the risk at the very top. They're just going to say, how much is the design specification change risk actually contributing to the model's p-values, to the dates, the durations, the costs? So in legacy tools, rebuilding the risk impacted plan without the risk being present is the logical solution. And I used to spend whole weeks working my way through the risk register doing this manually, resimulating the project risk model, recording the new output, measuring the delta, replacing it, and removing the next risk, praying and hoping that the team weren't going to then suddenly ask me to start again, give me a new version of the schedule because someone's asked for some urgent essential change, which did often happen, sadly. So if you've had a pressing deadline like a stage gate review submission, this level of effort always felt unfeasible within the time constraints that I was given for my work. So the other departments would often take up to the last possible moment to create their final version of the schedule, the associated cost to reflect that known scope at that time that fits with that schedule. So sadly, the risk analysis often came last in my experience. So when I first saw Safran Risk's automated sensitivity analysis about 4 or so years ago, you can imagine the impact it made on me when I was spending weeks on that kind of thing. So let me be clear about what Safran's approach to sensitivity analysis is actually doing. It is literally rerunning the simulation one additional time for each risk present within the risk model. But it's going to exclude one risk at a time, so it can measure the delta and report this back to you at your desired confidence level. So P75, P80, P50, whatever you want. Most significantly, you and the rest of your team can see the results in units of measure that are entirely relatable, days and dollars, without first having to, educate people or remind people what a correlation coefficient actually is, because that's what we were dealing with back on the previous tornado charts. So to go back to my previous example, 100 risks, the original simulation, so that's 101 simulations in total so far, and that's going to go through the whole 16,000 critical path network, CPM, and reschedule it all those times. Okay, and you can actually point this tool as necessary to a particular activity to interrogate that, or a mid-project milestone, a work breakdown status summary, or a hammock to reveal the relative contribution, if any, from each of the risk drivers present in your model listed down there. Now, what I've described here is when the automation is engaged in what's called a single pass mode. And that is really great for indicative day-to-day use. However, if you have a little bit more time on your hands, you might want to know what the contributions would have been if you'd removed each risk in quote unquote the correct order. Then instead we must use the multiple pass sort of mode. So let's continue with the example where there's 100 risks, and this begins by running the same single pass which we learned a moment ago was 101 simulations, which it uses to learn and inform which risk appears to contribute the most, and then it runs another 100 passes, but each time it does this, it runs one fewer simulation with each subsequent passes that removes one risk at a time, right? So now if you're wondering why on earth would you want to run 5,151 simulations where each simulation has 1,000 or 10,000 iterations inside each, are you a glutton for punishment? Well, it's because in this method, in multiple pass method, it's clearly going to take longer to complete, but by removing the biggest variables first, they can no longer distort or mask the true effect that the smaller risks may have been exerting on the model. But the good news is that there are a suite of configurable or configuration options that you can preset, such that you only interrogate the top n number of risks in the model, or once you hit an arbitrary amount of money, maybe it represents your contingency perhaps, once it's discovered that amount, it will just stop the multiple pass analysis and save on time, so you can be a bit more 80-20 about it in terms of Pareto principles and things. But also you can toggle whether or not the various sources of estimating uncertainty in the schedule and or the cost model are grouped together and treated as a single risk or as individual extra risk drivers in their own right. So that's another possibility. But furthermore, if you want to speed up any sensitivity analysis, you could always use the convergence tools from the main simulation setting to learn how few iterations you could potentially be getting away with. So, why run 10,000 iterations of Monte Carlo if you can yield the same outcome at just 1,000 iterations? So I'd like to think that communicating the effect of risk on your objectives in units of measure that are universally relatable would be an incredibly obvious benefit, as now you can hold cost-benefit analysis discussions with your project engineers, your project managers directly in relation to the upfront investment costs of the proposed treatment actions or the opportunities, which in turn directly affects decision-making on the shop floor of your projects. So not just for the overall project, but on the drill down to any significant work packages that lie on the critical or the near critical path. So I'm going to bring this presentation into land and summarize what we've covered here today with respect to the various differences in risk driver modeling input styles and the reporting outputs. So 7-point summary. 1, Safran allows you to continue using the legacy techniques such as assigning unique risk-ranged estimates to every activity in the schedule or the cost elements as variables. 2, Safran allows you to use any of the identified methods either exclusively or as a blend of any of the approaches that we discussed, and offer to see that transparently in real time how those things are going to affect one another before committing to the full simulation and maybe wasting your time. 3, that depending on where your project is in the life cycle, it will likely affect which method you use at that time, and it may need to switch as the project matures. 4, if you can move away from a gut feel qualitative guesswork type of model towards substantiated historical evidence-based approaches, it's desirable, but not strictly necessary, but it's definitely desirable. 5, Safran also allows you to take advantage of traditional risk model comparison reports, but also it's flexible enough to cater for any what-if scenarios that you wish to sort of throw at it and learn from. 6, that you can further enhance the quality of your risk driver reporting by using fully integrated cost and schedule risk analyses and then combining that with the schedule sort of like the sensitivity analysis that we looked at towards the end there. And then 7, that the time saved through automation of the sensitivity analysis itself can be better spent going through those what if scenarios, discovering insights, more insights, and building more business cases supporting tangible interventions, because it frees you from the traditional tornado charts that only speaks in a sort of statistical language that most people don't even really properly comprehend. So I'll leave this summary table up for a moment, and you might like to take a screenshot of it, and then I'm going to leave the link addresses up on the screen for a minute or two in a moment, where you can sign up to get a first look at the latest Safran risk features that are coming imminently out in the new version 22.1. But thank you to everybody that's joined me, and I hope you found this session to be helpful, considering what types of risk driver techniques you are using, or maybe your peers are using that you're not using, etc. So hopefully I framed that well for you across the various industries, and how you can use those in Safran risk and not be limited. So if you want to re-watch or share this session, then I can confirm it does actually remain on LinkedIn after the session closes. So thank you very much. Please send me any questions directly to chris.ritson@safran.com, or find me on LinkedIn and direct message me there on LinkedIn. And that's all from me today. So please take a screenshot of that, and I'll see you hopefully in a week's time. Thank you very much.